Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the lives of England's most remarkable queens in Part 2, beginning with the determined reign of Lady Margaret Beaufort, who shaped the Tudor dynasty through unwavering devotion to her son, and gently arriving at the steadfast era of Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess whose marriage would transform English history forever. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale. Share a comment about which of these Tudor-era queens resonates most deeply with you. And subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket. Let your thoughts slow and allow the soft echo of Tudor court life to carry you gently toward sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Margaret, later known as Lady Margaret Beaufort, entered this world on May 31st, either in 1441 or in 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, nestled in the peaceful countryside of Bedfordshire. Her father stood as John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who carried the bloodline of John of Gaunt, the fourth son of Edward III, genealogical connection that Margaret would skillfully exploit to legitimize her son Henry's claim to the throne. During the tumultuous Wars of the Roses, Margaret's mother was Margaret Beauchamp, daughter of Sir John Beauchamp of Bletsoe, and the heiress to her family's considerable fortune after her only brother John Beauchamp died childless and unmarried in 1421, making her an attractive and wealthy match for her first husband, Oliver St. John. His death in 1438 made her available for John Beaufort to marry. Margaret's pursuit of royal power was somewhat hindered by a series of scandals that had enveloped her family generations earlier. The first of these concerned her own father, who, after being imprisoned by the French following his capture at the Battle of Baugé in 1421 in Henry V's wars against the French king, paid a staggering £24,000 ransom, equivalent to £15 million today, to secure his release over 17 years later, in 1438. However, although he was impoverished by the extortionate price he had to pay for his release, he did benefit financially when he married Margaret from the vast estates that she held around Bedfordshire, Wiltshire, and Dorset. Although Margaret was the sole product of her mother's marriage to John Beaufort, Margaret Beauchamp was much more fruitful in her previous marriage, and so her daughter had many half-sisters and half-brothers, namely John, Oliver, Edith, Mary, Margaret, and Elizabeth St. John, a side of the family that Margaret Beaufort remained close with throughout her life. After marrying his wife, Margaret, in 1442, John Beaufort returned to the battlefield as a commander of an English regiment that was to fight against King Charles VII of France after his invasion of Gascony in 1443, presenting him with a perfect opportunity to reignite his military career. After being anointed Captain General of Aquitaine and Normandy, and bestowed with the title of Duke of Somerset by an Act of Parliament, John Beaufort set out to prove himself to his contemporaries. But his campaign to France went disastrously wrong. He was exposed as a poor and cowardly leader, who, although able to take some minor French towns, never had the courage to directly engage the French army, being further lambasted for allowing his men to pillage and plunder at will, and also for his misappropriation of royal funds, which he used to enrich himself. Returning to England after his disappointing tour of duty, Henry VI was so infuriated with his conduct that he refused to see him, and John Beaufort was left with no other option but to retire to his country estate in Dorset. Eaten away with unbearable shame, he decided to take his own life on May 27, 1444. His young daughter was barely a year old at the time. The humiliating conduct and death of Margaret's father was compounded by another, even more serious family transgression that happened even earlier, as the Beauforts' link to royalty was always somewhat tainted due to the fact that they originated from an initially illegitimate offshoot following John of Gaunt's relationship with Catherine Swynford, the governess to his children from his first marriage to Blanche of Lancaster, following the death of John's wife Constance in 1394, the woman he had been unfaithful to. relationship with Catherine was legitimized after they married in January 1396, which meant that all his future offspring would be officially recognized as having royal blood. Yet despite this, the fact that some of their children had been born out of wedlock meant that the scandals surrounding John of Gaunt lived on throughout the years, persisting all the way up to his great-great-grandson, King Henry VII, where it was used as a tool to invalidate his reign. Margaret herself was a woman of remarkable devotion, kindness, and generosity, and later in her life used her almost inexhaustible funds to donate heavily to the Church, an institution she had the utmost respect for, and that represented the received Christian religion that would serve as a guiding light for her in some of her darkest hours. Especially regarding the safety of her son, Margaret was a dedicated family woman who found purpose in her life safeguarding the Tudor bloodline, a desire that was emulated by the care and attention she always showed towards her beloved Henry, her only child. A primal protective instinct she also extended to her dearly loved grandchildren, whom she adoringly showered with gifts. The seriousness with which Margaret approached the survival of her bloodline could often spill over into her mischievous sense of humor, where all niceties would be set aside for those who had dared challenge her family, such as the rather overweight Duchess of Burgundy and her equally rotund entourage, who had supported a pretender to the throne. To Margaret, in a letter to the Queen's Chamberlain in April 1496, "They were great ladies all, and according to their great estates, they have great personages. Yet Margaret, although strong-willed in everything she set her heart on, was never needlessly cruel to her enemies, something that Henry took great pains to implement in his own reign." In addition, Margaret, who was renowned for her love of cards and was even known to place bets on chess, equally relished playing the game of real estate. During her early years, when her property was constantly threatened by her Yorkist rivals, she made every effort to maneuver herself into a stronger position, either through political intrigue or marriage. One of her main aims was to retain her inheritance for the sake of her son, Henry, and it was with this singular dedication to her son's welfare that she would eventually harbor the greatest ambition of them all for her son to become King of England. At the time of Margaret Beaufort's birth in 1443, the Kingdom of England was ruled by the House of Lancaster, an offshoot of the House of Plantagenet, which had governed England and its overseas possessions since 1154. Its weak-willed king, Henry VI, led efforts to resist the annexation of English lands in northern France by French Emperor Charles VII and his Burgundian allies in the closing stages of the 100 Years' War. This was a conflict that would not only lead to the dishonor of John Beaufort, but also to the eventual loss of England's entire realm abroad during Margaret's lifetime, and to the rise of another branch of the Plantagenets, the House of York, as serious contenders for the English throne. Following the death of Margaret's father, and in conjunction with the fact that she was of royal descent and no longer had a male protector, many noble houses in the realm became very interested in securing her wardship. It's a type of guardianship in which the selected family would be able to determine the fate of the infant heir's property. Margaret, being the eldest child of John Beaufort, had, in combination with her mother's impressive portfolio, also inherited all of the vast lands her father held in Kent, Worcestershire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Somerset, Essex, and Sussex, making her an extremely wealthy individual at a very young age. Beaufort's untimely passing, and the fact that Margaret was technically part of the royal family, sprung King Henry VI into action, who entrusted her wardship to William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk and steward of the king's household. He secured her betrothal to his own son John de la Pole in 1450, which was to be carried out when she was 12 and had come of age. However, despite being in the legal custody of the de la Poles, Margaret never left her ancestral home at Bletsoe Castle, where she would have shared her childhood with the numerous offspring of her mother's first marriage to Oliver St. John, including her half-brothers John and Oliver, and half-sisters Edith, Mary, and Margaret. At Bletsoe, Margaret enjoyed a privileged upbringing befitting a noble woman of her stature. Here, she would be taught to properly manage and administrate hereditary estates, listen to the finest musicians hired to entertain her aristocratic clan, and, alongside her half-sister, Margaret St. John, who would later become Abbess of Shaftesbury, would first be inducted into the Christian faith. She was taught about the importance of religion by her own devout mother, who would also instill in the young Margaret a voracious appetite to read, illustrated by her mother's will, in which she bequeathed to her many books, all of which were doubtlessly added to the impressive library Margaret fervently maintained as an adult. Nevertheless, after Margaret's betrothal to John de la Pole in 1450, she found herself at 6 years old at the center of a scandal that rocked England. Her guardian, the unpopular William de la Pole, was blamed for encouraging Henry VI to follow a policy of peace and cooperation with the King of France, which had resulted in the loss of a significant number of English possessions on the continent, and the retention of just Calais and Aquitaine by the end of Cos. My only lipstick, ruby kiss. Ruby kiss, ruby kiss. Only ruby kiss, ice, only ruby kiss. How will we see on? We see a lixt kicks. See, we see a lixt kick. EXK, we see, ECC, CC, we see, E. We see, you, see, ples. We see, guide see as it, by we see, by see it. They see up. I be seats a clade, by we see it. Hell I lease it sit, ca you be sick by the I secret says I lips. August 1450. These charges were made a lot worse by the further accusation that de la Pole was planning to take advantage of Margaret's royal stock to advance his own family's claim to the throne by marrying her to his son. Even after William de la Pole was killed by his enemies after being intercepted in the North Sea on his way to exile in France, found his ascendancy challenged by Richard, Duke of York, who in February 1452 marched on London. Although nothing came of it and he was eventually pardoned, tension continued to rise between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Henry was keen to consolidate his own support by awarding honors to those who had stuck by him in the face of the Duke of York's open hostility, including his half-brother Edmund Tudor. So, in February 1453, where her marriage contract with John de la Pole was nullified, and where she was repromised instead to Edmund Tudor, who, alongside his brother Jasper Tudor, became her new wards on March 24th. This was a personal triumph for the brothers, who were made rich beyond their wildest dreams, as they would now share Margaret's enormous inheritance between them. Now betrothed to a man who was a close confidant of the king, Margaret eagerly threw herself into court life, tending one of her first royal functions on April 23, 1453, at Windsor Castle for the Garter celebrations, where she appeared alongside Henry's glamorous Queen Margaret, bedecked in an exquisite red dress, a fashion statement that would no doubt have inspired the young and impressionable Margaret to follow suit after King Henry gifted her 100 marks for clothes on May 12th for her upcoming first meeting with her future husband, Edmund, the man who would tie her permanently to the Lancastrian cause. With the death of Margaret's uncle Somerset, one of Henry VI's most trusted advisors, a few days later on May 22, 1455, at the Battle of St. Albans, following the Duke of York's resumption of hostilities and marking the start of the Wars of the Roses, he was to remain her only male protector. Just 12 days after St. Albans, on March 31, 1455, Margaret married Edmund Tudor, which she retained. For the rest of her life, she settled with her new husband at Lambeth in Pembrokeshire, Wales, where Edmund was tasked with maintaining law and order and curbing the authority of the rebellious. This was a period of Margaret's life that was to be marked by uncertainty and anxiety. The first fray occurred when Edmund successfully seized the castle at Kermathon, compelling the Yorkists to reply by sending a force under the command of Sir William Herbert and Sir Walter Devereux, whose 2,000-strong regiment proved too strong for Edmund, and whose brief imprisonment on August 10, 1455, caused Margaret great despair, as the couple had successfully consummated the marriage, and she, was deeply afraid for the safety of her unborn child. Although Edmund was released to the great relief of his teenage bride, an even more tragic twist of fate was to happen when Margaret was just 6 months pregnant. First, 1456. A disease that Margaret, now alone and vulnerable in hostile territory, was so terrified would also kill her and the baby growing inside her that she requested every medical treatise on the illness that she could find in an obsession to keep it at bay, desperate for a protector. Jasper Tudor, fully aware of the danger his sister-in-law was in, dropped everything to come to her rescue. And a now heavily pregnant Margaret bid farewell to her marital home in mid-November, accompanying Jasper through cold winter winds to arrive at Pembroke Castle, where on January 28, 1457, after a brutal and exhausting labor, she gave birth to Henry. Thus began an unbreakable bond between mother and son, one that was to overcome the greatest of trials and tribulations, but was to be equally bolstered by glorious triumphs. Although Margaret had survived the ordeal of childbirth, it is likely that the internal damage she suffered that day meant she could never have children again. Known as churching, whereby the mother was to spend 5 weeks with her newborn away from men. After finishing this period with a ceremony of purification that allowed her to re-enter society, it was Jasper who would lead the search for Margaret's next husband, which commenced in March 1457 with a journey from Newport to Gwent, at the time being a young, unmarried heiress of extraordinary wealth. Margaret was considered a very eligible match, and with Jasper ever eager to strengthen the House of Lancaster, he decided it was best to give her hand in marriage to one of his loyal supporters, settling on the son of Humphrey Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, Henry Stafford. However, empowered by a powerful impetus to safeguard her young son's interests, showed a remarkable degree of involvement despite being just 13 years old, opting to accompany Jasper to Buckingham's estate at Greenfield in Newport, a journey of more than 100 miles that, even though this was only 2 months after she had given birth, she was willing to make, despite Henry Stafford's mother being the granddaughter of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, making him closely related to Margaret. A dispensation was granted by the Pope on April 6, 1457, after Margaret had completed the customary year of mourning for her deceased husband. The couple married on January 3, 1458, marking the start of a relationship quite at odds with the loveless political unions of the time, for it seemed Margaret and Stafford developed genuine feelings for each other, illustrated by the fact that they regularly celebrated their marriage anniversary every year thereafter with sumptuous feasts. On the other hand, only 5 days later, on January 8th, the joy of Margaret's wedding would be contrasted with the news that her son Henry was to become the joint ward of Jasper Tudor and the king's treasurer, the Earl of Shrewsbury. Although Henry would stay the majority of the time with Jasper at his castle at Pembroke, where the young prince could be assured of his safety, Jasper filled the void left by the death of the youth's father, developing his own unbreakable bond with his nephew, whom he treated like his own son, with Margaret assured that Henry was being lovingly cared for by his uncle. Although the union produced no children, she would live happily alongside her new spouse. But her thoughts would always turn back to her son Henry, whom she now saw infrequently. As a child, he was often sickly, and his frail health worried Margaret, immensely heightened by the sorrow of their separation. Nevertheless, as Margaret fretted about the health of her infant son while tirelessly proving herself as a devoted wife, factions at a ceremony known as Love Day, on March 24, 1457, in which the Duke of York symbolically followed in the steps of Henry and his queen for the realm to see, tensions continued to rise. This culminated in a major Lancastrian defeat at the Battle of Northampton on July 10, 1460. Father-in-law and head of her husband's house, the Duke of Buckingham. Consequently, Queen Margaret fled to Scotland, and on December 30, 1460, after being provided with an army by Mary of Guelders and with a group of vengeful English nobles at her back, she achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Wakefield, resulting in the deaths of the Duke of York and his 17-year-old son Edmund, Earl of Rutland. Yet Margaret and her family's jubilation was to be short-lived, coming to a sudden end after York's eldest surviving son, Edward, defeated Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461, with Henry VI and his queen taking flight. To France, the resurgent Yorkist rebel crowned himself Edward IV. A moment of utter devastation for Margaret, for now she believed her very life and the life of her beloved Lancastrian son were in the gravest danger they had ever faced. However, luckily for Margaret, it quickly became clear that Edward was not out for blood. In an attempt to patch the realm up, the king was exceedingly forgiving of his enemies. This act of clemency was perhaps made a lot easier given that Henry Stafford was the cousin of the new king, as their mothers were both sisters. The other hand, despite Margaret's inheritance and titles being relatively unaffected by the Yorkist changeover, Jasper Tudor was branded a traitor. As a result, the wardship of Henry, now 5 years old, was entrusted instead to one of his own henchmen, William Herbert, the same man who had captured his father Edmund at Carmarthen. To help further his cause, Herbert paid the king £1,000, around £643,000 in today's money, for the honor of being Henry's guardian, resulting in Henry moving across Wales from Pembroke to his new home at Raglan Castle. Like before, Margaret would endeavor to maintain as much contact as possible by frequently sending her son letters. For the first time, he would be able to mix with other children of noble stock at Raglan, as William Herbert, and, in particular, his wife, Anne Devereux, took a serious interest in the well-being of their young charge, providing him with great comfort and support. This was something the young Henry would never forget, even as king, when he later welcomed Anne Devereux to his court with open arms. Yet even though Henry was treated graciously by Edward, to Margaret's anger, this did not stop the new king from disinheriting many of his lands and giving them to his brother George, Duke of Clarence. Although Henry had been stripped of his title, his mother would still refer to him as Lord Richmond, ever hopeful she could return to him his birthright. For now, the best course of action was to reconcile with the House of York. Alongside her husband Henry Stafford, she proved herself a skillful political maneuverer throughout the 1460s, able to work her way to the good graces of Edward's regime while disassociating herself from the traitorous actions of some of her family members, such as the Duke of Somerset, who in 1463 deserted Henry VI for the Yorkists. However, after gaining great favor from Edward, he betrayed him by switching his allegiance back to Lancaster and was captured and executed on the battlefield on May 15, 1464, after being defeated by Edward's armies at the Battle of Hexham. In addition, with the later capture of King Henry VI in Lancashire in July 1465, and his subsequent imprisonment in the Tower of London for 5 years, it was more crucial than ever for Margaret to gain the favor of Edward. By December 1466, after Edward granted her the previously confiscated Beaufort Manor at Woking, which had belonged to her disgraced father, she had seemingly won his favor. For the next few years with Stafford, she would live a carefree existence in the Surrey countryside, visiting the local church of St. Peter, going on day trips to local towns such as Guildford for household supplies, and even trying her hand at hunting and hawking. However, despite her idyllic living situation and her increasing closeness with Stafford's family, whose mother and brother John became close companions, as well as her many trips to another of her childhood homes, Maxey Castle, to see her own mother Margaret Beauchamp as at Christmas 1466, when alongside her half-sister Elizabeth St. John she spent 6 weeks there. Margaret was always concerned about Henry. In September 1467, she would make the journey to Raglan Castle to visit him for a week, perhaps for the first time in many years, as it was the first recorded visit in Stafford's accounts. It was likely that the trip was far too short for Margaret and tinged with jealousy for William Herbert and his wife, a couple whom Margaret had no strong affinity for, but who had been given the privilege of raising her son, something that Margaret doubtlessly longed to do herself. Nevertheless, to realize her dream of getting her son back, Margaret would again have to play politics. In December 1468, she made enormous preparations to receive the king himself, buying for herself a luxurious red dress for the occasion and sparing no expense as she splashed out on an enormous 5-course meal, complete with an assortment of the finest seafood, an exuberant purple hunting tent, and the most talented musicians in the land. This visit aimed at determining her loyalty to the Yorkist regime, as a rift between Edward and one of his most important allies, the Earl of Warwick, was steadily growing. Many were appalled at Edward's choice of queen, Elizabeth Woodville, a woman of low noble stock whom Edward had married, quite controversially, for love. Yet Margaret's fealty to Edward, however necessary, would once again land her son in great peril. Her son Henry, accompanying his guardian, William Herbert, became involved in the ensuing conflict between the king and the Earl of Warwick at the Battle of Edgecote on July 24, 1469, a crushing defeat for the Yorkist faction that led to the capture and execution of William Herbert. When news of the outcome came to Margaret, she feared for her son's life, spending an inordinate amount of money to find out if he had been struck down like his guardian. To her relief, Henry had indeed survived and had been whisked far away to Weobley Castle in the care of Endeavour. With Henry VI seemingly in the ascendancy and William Herbert deceased, Margaret pounced on the opportunity to reclaim custody of her son and his birthright in a visit to London on August 24th, but to no avail. However, when the realm was resettled, on October 3, 1470, and Henry VI was reinstated, Margaret's luck turned for the better when she was finally given the opportunity to meet Henry again, this time in the company of the king himself, keen to meet the progeny of his greatly missed half-brother Edmund. He granted them an audience at Westminster on October 27th, and although it was decided that Henry was to resume being Jasper's ward, it was also proclaimed that Henry should spend some quality time with his mother beforehand. Margaret was elated, and in the next month, November, she would spend 2 weeks with her teenage son, who accompanied them to Woking, where she entertained him with a tour of the Surrey countryside. Most likely, the bond between mother and son was reinforced even further. But before long, Margaret would be heartbroken again as Henry left her company to join Jasper on November 11th. This grief would be intensified, for unbeknownst to both, the next time they would meet would be 15 years later, as Edward IV bounced violently back onto the scene. On April 11, 1471, Edward, who was popular in the capital, marched on London to great fanfare, declaring himself king and imprisoning Henry in the Tower of London. On May 4th, he went on to defeat a rescue force sent by Henry's wife, Queen Margaret, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, brutally slaughtering the young heir to the throne, Edward of Westminster, before banishing Queen Margaret back to France and murdering King Henry VI on May 21st. This unexpected turn of events had profound consequences on the standing of the young Henry Tudor. Margaret did not openly grieve the deaths of her Lancastrian kinsmen, for now, with the extinction of the Beaufort male bloodline, the crown was passed onto the female line, of which Margaret was the oldest, and, by extension, her son Henry. At her urging, Henry and Jasper fled the country in October, and after entering the North Sea, strong winds diverted their path to Brittany, where they were received graciously by Duke Francis II as noble captives. However, Margaret's misfortunes were not at an end, as on October 2, 1471, her husband Henry Stafford, who had been injured fighting for Edward's cause at the Battle of Barnet, succumbed to his injuries. In a testament to the love and respect he had for his wife's abilities, he named her the principal executor of his will, and most of his earthly possessions he bequeathed to my beloved wife Margaret, Countess of Richmond. In the meantime, being the mother of a potential rival to Edward IV, Margaret found herself in an incredibly precarious position. In order to improve her standing, she opted for a pragmatic marriage with pro-Yorkist Thomas Stanley, the steward of the king's household. While Margaret benefited from the closer proximity to the Yorkist fold, Stanley profited from the sizable inheritance his marriage to her entailed. A union of convenience cemented by a wedding ceremony that took place on June 12, 1472. Despite Margaret's essential political shift, she was also looking out for her son, placing some of her own ancestral lands in Devon and Somerset in a trust on June 2, 1472, for Henry to claim in the event that he returned. Margaret, however, was not content with living life on the sidelines. With her powerful new husband, an influential landowner with possessions in Cheshire, Lancashire, and northern Wales, where he exercised considerable local heft, she began making her mark on high society and allaying Edward's suspicions about her. She accompanied Stanley to his manors in Latham and Knowsley, settling land disputes in Liverpool in 1473 and 1474, where in one particular case she acted as one of the main judges. All the while, she became an influential presence at the royal court, where in 1476 she accompanied the Queen and her daughters for the reburial ceremony at Fothering of Richard, Duke of York. Despite her newfound popularity at the Yorkist court, Margaret maintained secret communications with her vagabond son, urging him not to return to England and to regard Edward's pledges with suspicion. The Yorkist king was trying to lure Henry back to England with promises of wealth, titles, and even marriage to his own daughter, which were no doubt insincere and would only lead to the young prince's death. It was clear that Henry deeply respected his mother's counsel, for in November 1476, after Francis II agreed to return Henry to Edward on the condition he was treated respectfully, Henry, faking illness, managed to escape the clutches of the English envoys sent to apprehend him by taking refuge in a church. After Henry's pursuers were driven off by townsfolk offended that they would breach the sanctuary of God, Francis was then persuaded to rescind his offer. Yet, despite her son's close call, Margaret continued to bend the knee to Edward. By 1480, after being entrusted with carrying Edward's youngest daughter Bridget to the font where she was to be christened, it was clear that Margaret had improved her position considerably. As she rose through the Yorkist ranks, she started to entertain the possibility that she could negotiate Henry's safe return. By June 1482, after the death of her beloved mother, Margaret finally produced some tangible results, agreeing with Edward that Henry was to be permitted to receive a portion of his grandmother's inheritance. This arrangement was marked by the king's stamp on a document dated June 3, 1482, in which it was proclaimed that if Henry were to return, he would be in the grace and favor of the King's Highness. However, with the stage set for Henry's return, Margaret's dreams would be crushed again with the unexpected death of Edward on April 9th, with the agreement yet to be finalized. Henry's fate became uncertain once more. The English crown was now usurped by Edward's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who, like many, had always despised the lowly origins of Edward's queen, Elizabeth Woodville. She now fought to prevent Richard from involving himself in the affairs of government and to ensure that the kingship smoothly transitioned to her son, Edward V. Yet her plans soon disintegrated after Richard, in combination with the Duke of Buckingham, the grandson of Margaret's ex-father-in-law, who had his own gripe with Elizabeth since he had been forced against his will to marry her low-born sister, intercepted the 12-year-old Edward V at Northampton. While the Queen and the rest of her children took refuge at Westminster Abbey, Edward and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were instead sent to the Tower of London, where their claim was deemed illegitimate by Richard, who crowned himself king on July 6, 1482, with Margaret's husband briefly arrested and Richard illustrating he would stop at nothing to eliminate all those who opposed him after the brutal beheading of Lord Hastings, one of Edward IV's most trusted counselors. Thomas Stanley was left with no choice but to indicate his support for Richard. Although Margaret attended the coronation banquet, deep down she resented her new king for ruining the arrangement that would finally have seen Henry return to her. Always thinking of what was best for her son, Margaret may have been involved in a failed plot to rescue the incarcerated princes from the Tower of London, as it is likely, she thought, that Henry would be more favorably received if Edward V, a young princeling of 12 years old, was on the throne. However, this was not to be, as although no one knows for certain, the most widely accepted version of events is that Richard, realizing that the security of his position would always be threatened by the princes, ordered them to be murdered. Whatever their fate, they were never seen again. With the disappearance of the young princes, and with the popularity of the usurper Richard III, who proclaimed his own son Edward as his heir, dwindling as a result of the widespread rumor that he had sanctioned the killings of his own nephews, Margaret's dedication to her son took on a whole new dimension. Now it was her mission to make Henry, with his pure Lancastrian blood, the King of England. Yet first, she would have to legitimize his claim, as Henry was unknown to many people, having spent a large portion of his life in exile. First, Margaret would have to arrange a marriage that would further validate his claim in the eyes of the people. So began negotiations with the family of the deposed Queen Elizabeth. The Woodvilles, whose daughter, Elizabeth of York, was the perfect candidate. Since the deaths of her brothers in captivity, many in the realm believed her to be the rightful heir to the throne, with the Woodvilles being heavily guarded at Westminster Abbey by Richard's men. Margaret employed the help of her trusted Welsh physician, Dr. Lewis of Carleon, who, entrusted with the marriage proposal, was able to pass through to Queen Elizabeth on the pretext that he was seeing a patient. Without arousing the suspicion of the men outside, he was able to deliver Margaret's message, which Elizabeth, stricken with grief for the disappearance of her two sons, and offered a chance to exact revenge on their murderer, firmly agreed to. With the conspiracy set in motion, Margaret became its architect, enlisting the support of many of Edward IV's former henchmen, including Giles d'Albany, Richard Guildford, Thomas Ramney, John Cheney, and most significantly, the Duke of Buckingham, the Duke who had originally conspired with Richard to place him on the throne. Now regretting his involvement, Teshley, in light of the young prince's demise, was willing to change allegiance. As Margaret stepped up recruitment, she informed Henry of her plan, assuring him that if he were to sail to Wales, he would find support waiting for him there. However, by October 11th, King Richard had cottoned on to the conspiracy. Initially believing that the Duke of Buckingham was the mastermind, he had him immediately outlawed. The Duke rose up in Wales on October 18th, as planned, yet heavy rain prevented them from entering England across the River Severn. Soon, the Duke was on the run from royal authorities as Henry, unaware of developments, landed in England a few days later, but turned back after growing suspicious of the claims that the Duke's uprising had been a success. The whole enterprise was a disaster, and the Woodvilles' uprising in Kent was also put down at the same time. Following the capture and decapitation of the Duke of Buckingham at Salisbury Marketplace on November 2nd, Richard became aware of Margaret's involvement in the plot, and suddenly she was at his mercy. Her life was only spared because the king, aware that he was deeply unpopular, realized he needed the support of her husband Stanley as a counterbalance to ensure his own political survival. Despite Margaret's miraculous escape, Richard was able to dish out reprisals for her treachery in other ways. In a devastating blow to her prestige, he declared that all of her lands, which she had sought to protect and maintain throughout her life, were to be transferred to her husband Stanley, and that for the foreseeable future, she was to remain under house arrest, with her husband as her jailer. But even though Margaret was locked up, she was still able to smuggle messages, probably with the knowledge of Stanley, out to Henry, who, during her incarceration, was busy drumming up support for a second invasion while avoiding Richard's efforts to apprehend him. With Duke Francis's health failing him, his treasurer Pyrlandos proved more susceptible to Richard's bribes, compelling Henry and his uncle Jasper Tudor to flee Brittany and disguise himself as a commoner in order to seek asylum with the King of France, Charles VIII, at the time a 13-year-old boy whose sister and Queen Regent, Anne de Beaujeu, luckily accepted him. Richard III was not so fortunate, as his own son Edward had suddenly died on April 9, 1484, and with his Queen Anne, unable to bear more children, rumors began to emerge that, to the alarm of Margaret, Richard was planning to marry Henry's betrothed, Elizabeth of York, whose beauty had started to become noted by the courtiers and nobles of the realm. adding a real sense of urgency as Henry organized his second attack. As Richard prepared his army and set up his headquarters in Nottingham for the coming invasion, he also took care to mount a scathing propaganda campaign against Henry. It was here that Margaret's checkered family history came back to haunt her. In a bid to delegitimize his rival Richard, he made sure to point out that her great-grandfather, John of Gaunt, had committed double adultery, and that as a result, Henry's claim to the throne, predicated on an untainted connection to the royal bloodline, was invalid, with Margaret communicating with her son every step of the way. Henry, with a 3,000-strong force at his back, which he was hoping would increase once he was in Britain, set off from Harfleur on August 1, 1485. On August 7th, he disembarked at Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire, on the Welsh coast, marching through Wales unopposed before setting up camp at Merevale Abbey. In the evening of August 21st, Henry was joined by his loyal followers, including John Wells, Margaret's half-brother. The next day, on August 22nd, both armies met at Market Bosworth, with Richard being the more experienced battle commander and possessing 3 times as many men. Margaret would doubtlessly have been worried about the outcome of the battle. In contrast, Henry had no battlefield experience. However, as the skirmish commenced, it was Margaret's own husband, Stanley, who betrayed Richard and turned the tide in Henry's favor. Richard was struck down as his horse slipped at the edge of a bog. To great fanfare, Henry entered Leicester, and 2 shouts of "God save King Henry!" he passed the first decree of his reign, informing the public that Richard was dead and that the men who fought the battle could all return home. Meanwhile, Margaret penned the auspicious news in her Book of Hours, simply writing, "This day King Henry VII won the field where was slain King Richard III." Following Henry's triumph at the Battle of Bosworth, it is reported that upon hearing the news of her son's victory, Margaret started sobbing uncontrollably, believing that such a great success was bound to be followed by a disaster. Luckily, her fears were mistaken, for instead, the coronation ceremony of King Henry VII went ahead without issue on October 30th, 1485. It would be his faithful uncle Jasper who was bestowed the ultimate honor of carrying St. Edward's crown up the aisle of Westminster Abbey. It was the culmination of Henry's first few weeks of office. It's a period of time he chose not to spend in London, but instead in a clear sign of his affection, with his mother at their ancestral home in Woking, where as a teenager he had spent a joyful 2 weeks with her before his exile. This place would always be dear to his heart. Throughout his reign, Henry would show himself eternally grateful for the tireless support of his mother, writing in a letter to her, "I shall be as glad to please you as your heart can desire it, and I know well that I am as much bounden to do so as any creature living for the great and singular motherly love and affection that it hath pleased you at all times to bear towards me." Indeed, convening his first Parliament on November 7, 1485, Henry gave everything to his mother, proclaiming her to be a femme sole, a woman who did not require her husband's consent and was solely responsible for all of her business affairs. At a stroke, he made Margaret one of the most powerful women in England. As an illustration of the implicit trust he had for his mother, Margaret was lavished with further honors and responsibilities, including the wardship of the young Duke of Buckingham on August 3, 1486, whose father had sadly perished in Margaret's first unsuccessful attempt to bring down Richard III. Margaret was further honored by her son in 1487, when she was allocated all of the estates formerly belonging to Henry Holland, Duke of Exeter, including Coldharbour Mansion on the Thames, which she made her principal residence alongside more estates in Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, and Kendal. At Christmas 1487, she was given robes and a circlet matching those of a queen, the leading female figure of the reign, whose power was greater than even that of her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York. She also assumed the title of My Lady. The king's mother, Margaret, relished her new standing, using her income to become a great patron of the arts. Her first major achievement in this area occurred in 1489 when she commissioned a translation of the French romance Blanchardin and Égalité, with the help of writer diplomat, printer, and translator William Caxton. By 1494, her reputation as a lover of literature was so renowned that Wynkyn de Worde, the editor of a reissued version of Scale of Perfection, a religious work originally written by Walter Hilton, dedicated the entire volume to her. Margaret herself was an expert translator of religious works, setting aside an enormous portion of her waking hours to the translation of The Mirror of Gold for the Sinful Soul from French, as well as the fourth book of The Imitation of Christ, published originally by Thomas à Kempis and released in 1504 and 1506, which became the standard translated edition until it was replaced by another in 1531. In addition to promoting the best literary works of her day, Margaret's personal chapel, overseen by 34 members of staff, almost equal in size to the King's Chapel, became an important center for the innovation of polyphonic music. It was also the same site where Margaret practiced as a committed Christian, a quality that was even recognized by the Pope in 1494, when he proclaimed her a paragon of the Church for her ceaseless promotion of the feast of the name of Jesus. Although Margaret was a devout woman of God, she was also brutally practical and could be particularly cutthroat in her property dealings. This was the case in 1492, when she advanced her own claim on lands situated in Wiltshire and Somerset as heiress of her great-uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort. His original philanthropic intentions to use them to fund the Hospice of St. Cross in Winchester were ignored by Margaret, who, upon acquiring them, also disinherited Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick, and Salisbury. In the process, on the other hand, Margaret could be equally generous on occasion, and evidence suggests she was highly concerned with the welfare of her Lincolnshire tenants. She was a popular landlord, promoting and funding many developments in the area, including the building of a tidal sluice in the seaside town of Boston and the establishment of a royal commission that worked to make the River Witham more navigable. Although Margaret always kept herself busy, she reserved time for her grandchildren and generously gave them many gifts. To her grandsons, Prince Edward and Henry, she bought many fine clothes and books, including a copy of Cicero's De Officis for Edward in 1495. To her granddaughter, Princess Margaret, she sent precious jewelry and brooches on many occasions, also being a proud godmother to her alongside the youngest, Prince Edmund. She was also heavily involved in the marriage arrangements of her grandson Arthur, Prince of Wales, to Catherine of Aragon before his tragic death in 1502. In 1498, she requested that the young Spanish princess learn French to communicate and also to accustom herself to drinking wine, as the water in England was not drinkable before she entered the royal court, in an indication that she liked to know everything about a newcomer entering her beloved family. She even had a list of Catherine's attendants drawn up, with Arthur and Catherine of Aragon married by proxy in 1499. Margaret eagerly recorded Catherine's arrival in Plymouth in her Book of Hours on October 2, 1501. She was in attendance for their wedding on November 14th, preparing a great celebratory feast at Cold Harbor afterwards, intending to impress her Spanish guests. On July 5, 1503, she would again play the role of gracious hostess by entertaining the entire royal family before her granddaughter. Margaret went north to marry James IV of Scotland to become the Queen of the Scots. Later in her life, Margaret changed her main residency from Cold Harbor to Collie Weston in Northamptonshire between 1499 and 1506, where she set up a court complete with a council house and prison. She was imbued with so much authority that on some occasions she was empowered to speak on behalf of the king, illustrated by a letter she wrote to administrators in Coventry addressing the plight of a wronged citizen. At other times, she was permitted to intervene in cases usually reserved only for ecclesiastical courts, such as a lawsuit concerning John Stockesley, a churchman in line for the prestigious bishopric of London. His accession was hampered when it was alleged he had committed a plethora of crimes, the most unusual of which involved the baptism of a cat for the purposes of finding a secret treasure, and another involving the Holy Maid of Leominster, whose fantastical claim that she only needed the bread and wine of the Eucharist to survive was quickly found to be patently false. By 1504, Margaret's annual income was over £3,000 a year, allowing her to splash out on the finest jewels and to increase the size of her household to such a degree that it rivaled even the king's. At the same time, Margaret always took her duties very seriously and made sure that her royal status was always highlighted, either through the royal insignia embellished on her surviving Book of Hours, or through her carefully styled signature of Margaret R, which she began to adopt from 1499. Her dedication to the maintenance of the Tudor regime was further seen in her desire to keep up to date with foreign relations, such as when she requested a detailed pamphlet be sent to her concerning the visit of King Felipe of Castile in 1506. She tirelessly attempted to strengthen the Tudor position by relentlessly pursuing her family's claim to the lands of Cadiz, so to lands of Cadiz or Liens in France, which were, in her mind, wrongfully owned by King Louis XII. She felt so strongly about the matter that in 1502, despite being 52 years old, she undertook the grueling journey to Calais to lodge her grievance. It was also in this phase of her life that Margaret became a major benefactor for the University of Cambridge. A 1503 charter illustrates that she used her considerable wealth to secure funding, while also appointing men from her own household to the most important posts, such as John Fisher, who was made Chancellor of Cambridge and who accompanied Margaret for the opening of Christ's College in 1506, a now world-famous center of education, whose development was kick-started by Margaret's purchase of the manors of Malton and Roydon. Another of Margaret's followers, Henry Hornby, made the dean of the chapel. Later went on to supervise the progress of St. John's College, built between 1505 and 1509. Thanks to a sizable donation from Margaret of £1625 at New Year 1507, 3 years after the death of her husband Stanley on July 29, 1504, Margaret received the news that her son Henry, now 50 years old, had become dangerously ill with quinsy, a bacterial infection of the tonsils. The seriousness of the matter became evident after he was unable to eat or drink for 6 days straight, causing Margaret's motherly instincts to kick in. So determined was she to nurse him back to health that she moved to Richmond Palace to take charge of the king's household. Alongside medical supplies, she also insisted that black material be delivered to her. Such was her fear that Henry would slip into death. Fortunately, by the autumn, and to Margaret's relief, Henry had fully recovered when the king fell ill once again in 1508. And with the realization that the sickness was persistent, thoughts turned to Henry's successor, the future Henry VIII, a popular figure at court who had turned 16 years old in June 1507. Margaret doted on him and had that month given him his first ever saddle and harness to celebrate his first joust. However, the young prince found he would have to adapt to kingly life quicker than he thought. In February 1509, when Henry VII was once again struck down by pestilence, this time tuberculosis, Margaret again rushed to Richmond and ready to stay there as long as possible, arranged for all of her belongings, including even her favorite bed, to be transported. But Margaret and all who attended the dying monarch realized at once that the diagnosis was grave, as according to one source, all that stood about him scarcely might contain them from tears and weeping. On April 21st, after taking his last Mass, Henry VII died later that day, leaving Margaret absolutely heartbroken. Now it was up to Margaret, who was placed at the top of the king's executors on his will, and who was herself experiencing ailing health, to arrange a proper send-off for her son. His body was first embalmed and then moved from the Privy Chamber to the Great Chamber of Richmond, where he lay for 3 days to the sounds of daily dirges and masses, before being transferred to the Great Hall and then the chapel for 3 days each. Finally, his coffin was carried from Richmond to St. Paul's, where, after a moving sermon and mass overseen by Bishop Fisher on May 10th, he was then interred in his tomb at Westminster the next day. His household staff threw in their staves of office in the grave before leaving to celebrate Henry's life in a great feast afterwards. With her dear son laid to rest, Margaret did not let grief nor ill health get in the way of preparing the way for her grandson's accession. In the interregnum, she was recognized by all as the unofficial queen and used her authority to make sure that Henry was surrounded by the right people when he finally took office. This involved reaffirming the loyalties of the men who had served her son well, such as John Fisher, Charles Somerset, Margaret's illegitimate cousin, and Richard Fox, the Bishop of Winchester, as well as removing some corrupting influences from the royal household, such as Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, Henry's much reviled tax collectors, the latter of which Margaret had a personal grudge against after he acted unfaithfully in a previous property deal, and both of whom were arrested and then executed when the young Henry VIII married the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. June 11, 1509. It was unclear whether his grandmother herself was in attendance, as she was becoming increasingly frail, something that Margaret herself was very aware of. After turning 66 years old in May, one chronicler noted how she feared that if she was to live longer, her body daily should have waxen more unwieldy, her sight should have been darkened, and her hearing should have dulled more and more. Her legs should have failed her by and by, and all the other parts of her body waxed more creased every day, which things should have been matter to her of great discomfort. Despite despairing of her own physical condition, Margaret was able to hold on just long enough to attend the joint coronation of Henry and his new bride Catherine on June 24th, a grandiose affair in which the royal couple walked the streets of London to great aplomb, in the same finery that Henry's father and his first wife, Elizabeth of York, had worn for their special day a generation earlier. With their new subjects cheering and applauding, they made their way from the Tower of London to Westminster for the ceremony, a procession in which Margaret, wearing a black bonnet and a dress made out of velvet, satin, and silk, watched from the comfort of a private residence in Cheapside she had bought specially for the occasion. At Westminster Abbey, she opted to be similarly low-key, tucking herself away in a private viewing chamber while she observed the coronation service, overseen by the Archbishop of Canterbury, in the same manner as she had done when she had first heard the news that her son Henry had triumphed over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. She cried for the day, difficulties that were bound to follow in the wake of such a happy and momentous occasion. And although she made a public appearance at the great feast that followed, she did not take part in the entertainments afterwards. Instead, she made her peace with God and removed herself to the abbot's house in Westminster Abbey, where she awaited her death. Food poisoning finally took her over the edge, for by June 28th, on Henry's 18th birthday, Margaret was on her deathbed, having done everything in her power to ensure that Henry was properly prepared for kingship. The next day, on June 29th, 1509, according to a witness who was by her side, the bishop said Mass before her, and as he lifted up the precious host, this worthy lady expired. And so, as she had honored the Blessed Sacrament, even so, the last thing that ever she saw, as I do think, was God. It was a fitting end for a woman who had spent so much of her time as an ardent worshipper of God. She is now joyful in that celestial court of heaven, where she shall be in eternal felicity forever. Being an extremely wealthy heiress at a young age, Margaret would become embroiled in the political affairs of the realm through no choice of her own. Her loyalties to the Lancastrian fold were predetermined by the men who early on ran her life and dictated her future. In her formative years, after the death of her father, when she was a one-year-old baby, she had no independence of her own. Margaret would prove a useful political pawn for Henry VI to auction off to the highest bidder, and with the added attraction of her royal blood, however tainted, he was easily able to find buyers. The first being William de la Pole, who decided to immediately betroth her to his son, John de la Pole. As an oblivious 6-year-old girl, Margaret would become the center of a scandal that rocked the very foundations of the kingdom. After accusations that William de la Pole was using his young charge to make his own beeline for the throne, as quickly, Margaret's fate would be determined again by powerful men. taking her down a path that would ultimately put her squarely in the Lancastrian camp during the Wars of the Roses after it was decided she would marry Edmund Tudor. From this brief and heartbreaking union would emerge the most important person in her life, Henry. From the moment she first set eyes on him, she vowed she would do everything in her power to safeguard what was owed to him by birthright, his inheritance. With Edmund dying of the plague, Margaret entered into her second marriage with Henry Stafford, who would be an assuring and loving presence as her son Henry, only a few months old, was taken from her and transferred into the custody of his uncle, Jasper Tudor, to be raised and protected in Pembroke Castle, Wales. Although Margaret found it easy enough to settle into a peaceful existence in the Surrey countryside, she constantly thought about her son, keeping in regular communication with him, and receiving frequent updates about how he was faring. But with the ousting of King Henry VI in 1461 by Edward IV, Margaret was suddenly struck with fear for her son's safety as the Yorkist clan consolidated their rule of the kingdom. Luckily for her, the new monarch proved magnanimous, and with Jasper Tudor following his half-brother the king into exile, Henry's guardianship was allocated instead to Lord William Herbert, where he was treated with love and respect. However, with her son still separated from her, Margaret embarked on a new strategy throughout the 1460s, one that involved proving her loyalties to the Yorkists with the aim of preserving Henry's inheritance. By 1470, after Henry was briefly reinstated as king, the future looked bright for Margaret, who was reunited with her cherished son and was able to spend a blissful 2 weeks with the teenager at her Woking manor. Yet Margaret would be left inconsolable. Once again, after Edward IV returned to the throne and Henry was forced to flee into exile with his uncle Jasper. Throughout the 1470s and early 1480s, a devastating period where smuggled letters were to be her only form of communication with Henry. She knew she would have to win back Edward's good graces all over again if she were ever to see her son granted safe passage back to his homeland. By 1482, with the help of time and calculated political gestures, Margaret had improved her position in the royal fold to such a degree that Edward was willing to allow Henry to return and for him to be legally endowed with property. However, Margaret's plans were to be totally ruined with the usurpation of the crown by Richard III, a vindictive and cruel ruler. Following the murders of Edward's successors at the Tower of London, Margaret sprung into action, determined to place her own son on the throne, employing her signature political astuteness. She arranged the marriage of Elizabeth of York with Henry to further legitimize his claim by joining the houses of York and Lancaster. But with Margaret's first scheme to destroy Richard's regime going terribly wrong, her life was only spared by her marriage to her third husband, Stanley, whose support the increasingly loathed Richard needed to guarantee his own political survival. Margaret remained undeterred by the house arrest and the confiscation of all her properties that followed, still keeping secretly in touch with Henry, whose defeat of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth finally liberated her from her shackles and reunited her with her son after 15 long and arduous years. With Henry crowned the King of England, she finally became the arbiter of her own destiny. As the king's mother, Margaret became the most powerful woman in the realm, with her inheritance and income now assuredly protected by her femme sole status. She began shaping England in her own image, enriching and entrenching the Tudor family into the very fabric of society via her hawkish accumulation of landed estates. She set up her own judicial system in the East Midlands at Northampton, where her sound and respected judgments saw her regularly intervene in normal as well as ecclesiastical courts. She used her vast resources to fund the translation of monumental literary works, nursing the intellectual heritage of the realm by heavily investing in Cambridge University, all the while molding herself into a paragon of faith. She made sure to give generous offerings to religious institutions and diligently followed the rituals and rites of Christianity for her own salvation, a faith that would indeed be tested by the premature deaths of many of her grandchildren, most notably Prince Arthur, but most significantly by the passing of her own son, Henry. His death affected her so immensely that she was barely able to hold on to her own life for much longer thereafter. But as always, driven by a sense of familial duty, she made it her mission to survive until she was assured of the continuity of the Tudor dynasty. After it was confirmed by the coronation of her grandson, King Henry VIII, her life's work was seemingly completed. Margaret, retiring to the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, passed away a mere 2 weeks later, doubtlessly eager to reunite with Henry, for she could not live without him. Catherine, later known as Catherine of Aragon, entered this world on December 16, 1485, in the palace of Alcalá de Henares, on the outskirts of Madrid. Her given name when born was Catalina, although she is widely known today by the version of her name which she adopted in England, the country where she would spend her entire adult life. Her father stood as King Ferdinand II of Aragon, one of the two constituent kingdoms of Spain at that time. Ferdinand's domains were in the north and east of the Iberian Peninsula, centered on cities such as Barcelona, Zaragoza, and Valencia, while the Aragonese had also carved out a small Mediterranean empire in the late Middle Ages, including the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Sicily, and much of southern Italy, including the city of Naples. Catherine's mother was Queen Isabella I of Castile, the ruler of the other part of Spain. Castile encompassed the greater part of mainland Spain and extended from the northern coastline, south through Madrid and Toledo, towards the south of the country. Though by the time of Catherine's birth in 1485, a small enclave around Granada, in the extreme south of the country, remained in Muslim hands, it was not until 1492 that her parents completed the reconquest of Spain and expelled the last Muslim powers back into North Africa. Catherine's parents had an unusual arrangement, whereby Isabella effectively ruled Castile and Ferdinand governed Aragon. The terms of their marriage stipulated that their jurisdictions remain separate during their lifetimes. It would not be until the early 16th century that Spain would be ruled as one nation by a single monarch. Catherine's descent and early family life were peculiar and related to subsequent events in her life. On her mother Isabella's side, she was descended from the House of Lancaster of the English royal family, in Catherine's case from John of Gaunt, the third son of King Edward III, who had ruled England between 1327 and 1377. In 1371, John had married Constance of Castile, linking the English royal family with the royal family of the Kingdom of Castile. As a result, Catherine was distantly related to the English royal line, and as befitted a young princess who was a member of two European royal dynasties. She received her education from a number of esteemed scholars, including two Dominicans, Pasquale de Empudia and Andres de Morales, and the Italian humanist brothers Alessandro and Antonio Geraldine. Emphasis was placed by them on Latin texts, but Catherine was also educated in European languages. As befitted the daughter of a king and queen, who were known throughout Europe as the most Catholic of monarchs, there was a heavy emphasis on placing any learning she received in a Catholic Christian context, and the Bible and other liturgical texts were studied from early on. She evidently excelled in all of these, and many years later, Catherine was praised for her learning by none other than Erasmus of Rotterdam, the foremost scholar of the early Northern Renaissance. Catherine might have been born in Spain, but the infinitely more significant events in shaping her later life would be played out far to the north in England. In the years prior to and following her birth, since the mid-15th century, that country had been plagued by civil wars brought about by the psychological collapse of King Henry VI. In the early 1450s, 30 years of unrest followed as Richard, 3rd Duke of York, and then his son, Edward, tried to assert their claim to the throne. Edward finally succeeded in this and became King Edward IV, but when he died in 1483, his brother Richard usurped the throne and became Richard III. Then a new pretender arose by the name of Henry, Tudor, a descendant of a Welsh family with a very tenuous claim to the throne of England. In 1485, Henry landed in England with an army and won a famous battle against Richard at Bosworth Field in the English Midlands on August 22, 1485. Richard was killed that day, and Henry was proclaimed king as Henry VII. But Henry never lost sight of the fact that his family's claim to the throne was weak and a new pretender could arise at any time. Indeed, several did, but unsuccessfully. Thus, he would need to form alliances with some of Europe's leading royal families. And he would also need to impart to his children the absolute necessity of securing the Tudor line and protecting the family's claim to the English throne. A sign of the English king's obsession with doing so was evident. Already in the late 1480s, in September 1486, when Catherine in Spain was still shy of her first birthday, Henry VII and his wife, Elizabeth, had their first child, a boy called Arthur. By the end of the 1480s, despite Catherine and Arthur still being toddlers in their respective royal households in England and Spain, Henry was already intent on entering into negotiations with Isabella and Ferdinand to bring about a marital agreement between young Arthur and Catherine. By the spring of 1488, Rodrigo González de Puebla, a doctor of law and Spanish diplomat, was in England to negotiate the terms of such a union. Both sides were anxious at this time that an alliance would be cemented, as Spain's rivalry with neighboring France was growing in a way that would soon see both nations vying for dominance of the Italian peninsula. An agreement seemed to have been near completion in 1489, but negotiations broke down over a disagreement regarding the size of Catherine's dowry and how her household would be maintained in England through English crown funding. Nevertheless, these negotiations did result in the signing of the Treaty of Medina del Campo between England and Spain in 1489, whereby the two nations allied with each other. While the marriage was not fully agreed to at this point, it remained viable. In the meantime, Catherine was growing up. She continued her education, which broadened as she got older to include arithmetic, law, history, philosophy, and some basics of heraldry and genealogy, the latter being an obsession of Europe's royal dynasties and noble families as they tried to ensure the continuity of their lines, an issue which would become paramount in Catherine's life in later years. She traveled widely as all of this was being imparted to her. Her parents, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, were anxious to make their presence felt across Spain as they united the two kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and they spent time in each of the provinces as the royal court maintained a wandering existence in the 1480s and 1490s. As a result, Catherine was present at the fall of Granada in 1492, when the Muslim emirate there finally fell and Spain was brought fully under Catholic rule. Curiously, although she was still just a child at the time, Catherine seems to have remembered the episode, and she later chose the pomegranate, known as the Granada apple in Spain, as her personal emblem. Somewhat ironically, the pomegranate was a fertility symbol in early modern times. She cannot have been aware at the time she first used it as a symbol how much her life and all of England would be impacted by the vexed issue of her childbearing. In the mid-1490s, negotiations resumed yet again between Henry VII's government in England and Catherine's parents' government in Spain concerning the proposed union between her and Prince Arthur. Henry's hold on the English throne had been questioned in the intervening period by a pretender by the name of Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be King Edward IV's son, Richard, who had almost certainly perished in the Tower of London at the hands of his uncle in the mid-1480s. Warbeck was at large in various places on the continent and then in Ireland between 1491 and 1497 before he was finally apprehended and imprisoned. The whole episode had revealed two things. Firstly, it indicated how tenuous the hold of the Tudors on the English crown was. And secondly, it showed Henry that the Spanish monarchs were certainly the right choice for a marriage alliance. While a host of the European powers had been very willing to support Warbeck's cause in order to undermine England, Isabella and Ferdinand had been incredulous at the idea that Warbeck was the deceased prince and had worked with the English king to expose the fact that Warbeck was actually an upstart from the Low Countries. And so, as Warbeck was heading towards his arrest, renewed intensity was lent to the negotiations over Catherine and Arthur's proposed marriage. Eventually, A new agreement was reached between the respective governments of England and Spain on October 1st, 1497. The marriage would go ahead. But since neither Catherine nor Arthur were yet even teenagers, it would not take place until Arthur reached the age of 14, at which time Catherine would be 15. A papal dispensation would still be required even at that stage for the wedding to take place because they were so young, and that would be sought from Pope Alexander VI. A dowry of 200,000 escudos would be paid by the Spanish to Henry VII. In return, Catherine would receive revenues from the lands which Henry had assigned to Prince Arthur for his use. These would be used to pay for Catherine's household and affairs in England until such time as she became queen. With this revised treaty in place, assent was finally given to the proposed marriage which had first been mooted nearly a decade. Earlier, it was ratified in January 1498, although some doubts remained about whether it would go ahead. These were finally allayed in May 1499 when a proxy wedding was held in England while Catherine was still in Spain. Further bickering over some of the financial specifics continued in the months that followed. But at last, in the autumn of 1501, Catherine set off from Spain to England. She would never return to her homeland. Catherine landed at Plymouth in the southwest of England on October 2, 1501. There then followed a 5-week-long procession through southern England, during which she was joined by King Henry and her soon-to-be husband, Prince Arthur. Before they arrived in London on November 12th, here elaborate pageants and banquets were held before. Arthur and she were married at St. Paul's Cathedral on November 14th. Exactly what followed would become a matter of extensive debate 30 years later. But Catherine was to later claim that although she and Arthur shared a bed on several occasions over the next few months, they never consummated their marriage. The other facts of what followed are uncontested. Within weeks of their marriage, Arthur, who was Prince of Wales, set out for Ludlow Castle to provide ceremonial governance of the principality. Catherine went with him, but in Wales, they both quickly contracted the sweating sickness, a mysterious illness which was most likely caused by a rodent-borne hantavirus. Catherine survived, but Arthur did not, and when he died on April 2, 1502, Catherine was left as a 16-year-old widow. In a foreign land, the long-planned marriage, which had been the subject of negotiations throughout the entirety of Catherine and Arthur's young lives, had lasted less than 4 months. News was quickly sent concerning Arthur's demise to London, and from there, dispatches were sent by King Henry's government to Spain to inform Catherine's parents that their daughter was already a widow. These same dispatches were quickly responded to. Would it be possible, Isabella and Ferdinand wondered, for Catherine to now marry Henry's second son, also named Henry after his father? The boy was only just about to turn 12 years of age, but if they waited a few years, he and Catherine could wed and the Anglo-Spanish alliance could be continued. When this proposal came to England, it was received positively. Both sides were anxious for the alliance to be secured, and as such, they quickly worked out the new agreement. By September, a draft treaty was prepared, with many of the financial arrangements continued from Catherine's marriage to Arthur to her new, proposed one with Henry. The formal treaty was finalized in the summer of 1503, and it was agreed that it would be solemnized following receipt of a fresh papal dispensation, and once Henry reached 15 years of age. What is interesting is that neither side seems to have been overly concerned at this time about whether Catherine and Arthur had consummated their marriage, and it was simply assumed that they had. No major objections were raised to Henry marrying his sister-in-law from a marriage which had potentially been consummated. While all of this was proceeding in England, the international situation was in a renewed state of flux. Catherine's mother, Queen Isabella, died on November 26, 1504, because the terms of her marriage arrangement with Ferdinand many years earlier had specifically stated that he could not rule Castile and Isabella could not rule Aragon in their own rights. Isabella was now succeeded by her older daughter, Catherine's sister, Juana. Juana had married Archduke Philip of the Austrian Habsburgs some years earlier. Philip's family ruled Austria and the Burgundian inheritance of the Low Countries and parts of northeastern France. while they also had held the position of Holy Roman Emperor for several generations. Consequently, the union of the Spanish royal dynasty of the Trastámaras and the Austrian Habsburgs was now set to create a dynastic union which would unite large sections of Western and Central Europe under one house. This would eventually occur in the shape of Juana and Philip's son, Charles, who would play a major role in his Aunt Catherine's life later on. But for now, the situation in Spain was that Juana became queen there. However, her own father, Ferdinand, was soon trying to establish himself as the all-but ruler of Castile, arguing that his own daughter was mad. All this was playing out as Catherine's marriage to Henry was being negotiated. The diplomatic unrest in Spain had a direct impact on Catherine and the marriage negotiations in England. King Henry VII was now having second thoughts. He and his counselors speculated that perhaps it would be best to support Juana and her husband Philip against King Ferdinand. In what was turning into a polarizing issue in Spain, bordering on civil war within Castile. Accordingly, for a time in 1505 and early 1506, seemed as though the marriage agreement would be renounced, a development which seemed all but assured when King Henry sent over £100,000 to Archduke Philip in the Low Countries to aid him in his and his wife's clash with Ferdinand. The English monarch at this stage was unwilling to tie his son and heir into a marriage with Catherine, which would become politically useless if Ferdinand was defeated by Juana and Philip, as had so often been the case, though, in Catherine's affairs, fate intervened. Philip died suddenly in Spain in September 1506, and the way was now cleared for Ferdinand to establish control over Castile. And so, he effectively had his daughter confined to house arrest on the grounds that she was insane. Thus, with Ferdinand secure in his control of Castile, Henry yet again began to consider marrying his son to Catherine, but the uncertainty would drag on for several more years. We might ask, where exactly was Catherine during this long period of uncertainty in England, and what was she doing? As the widow of the Prince of Wales, the Spanish princess had been granted Durham House, the residence of the Bishop of Durham in London, as her own residence. Here she maintained an almost entirely Spanish entourage and was visited frequently by the Spanish ambassadors to England. She was learning English, although she was still far from fluent by 1505, by which time she had been in the country for nearly 4 years. It is a sign of her reliance on her Spanish companions that she was still not fully versed in the native tongue after so long in England. Unfortunately, she had also been ill regularly, probably with tertian ague, a kind of mild form of malaria. But the greater problem for her was her financial position, as the penny-pinching Henry VII had consistently failed to abide by the terms of her marriage arrangement with Arthur and provide adequate support for her household. Her allowance was even revoked altogether for a time in 1505, as Henry lost interest in the new marriage negotiations. Additionally, concerted efforts were made to ensure that there was little contact between her and Prince Henry, her proposed marriage partner. As such, it was a difficult time for Catherine in the mid-1500s. A distinct change in Catherine's fortunes occurred in February 1508. That spring, a new Spanish ambassador, Gutierre Gómez de Fuensalida, arrived in England, specifically charged with finalizing the long-running marriage negotiations. Though these dragged on for months, the impasse was broken on April 21, 1509, when King Henry VII died. The new king, Henry VIII, Catherine's long-proposed husband, summoned Fuensalida just over 2 weeks later and declared that one of his father's dying wishes had been for the marriage to proceed. It is unclear if the old king had actually said this or not, but the result was the same in any event. On June 11, 1509, 7 years after the marriage of Catherine and Henry had first been mooted, the couple were married at the Franciscan church at Greenwich Palace. She was 23. He was just a few days shy of his 18th birthday. And less than 2 weeks later, on Midsummer's Day, June 24, 1509, Catherine was crowned as Queen of England at Westminster Abbey next to her husband, who was anointed the same day as King Henry VIII. After nearly 8 years in England, Catherine's persistence had paid off. It was a clear sign of the tenacity she would show many years later when Henry became determined to end their marriage. Catherine held a considerable amount of influence over her husband and consequently over England's political affairs in the first years of Henry's reign. The political climate of these years for England was similar to what it had been for well over 200 years. Henry's enemies were France and Scotland, and the king viewed himself as a monarch along the lines of his medieval predecessors, dating back to the days of King Edward I. In essence then, his duty was to make war on France and make it clear to the Scots that England was the predominant power in Britain. Thus, after briefly flirting with a possible amiable approach to the French, he quickly discarded that possibility, and he would spend much of his long 38-year reign spending vast sums of money to try to restart the 100 Years' War with France, which had its heyday during the reign of Edward III in the 14th century. He also had responsibilities elsewhere, notably across the Irish Sea, where the English lordship had declined to a point where only Dublin on the east coast and a few of the surrounding counties such as Meath and Kildare were effectively under English rule. Overall, there was a more fluid situation facing England on the international stage when Henry and Catherine became king and queen. In 1509, Catherine's influence over her husband was manifested quickly. Within weeks of their marriage, she ensured that the Spanish ambassador was recalled home, and for a time thereafter, she actually acted as her father Ferdinand's official line of communication in England. And while a new ambassador, Don Luis Carlos de Villaragat, eventually arrived in 1510, Catherine continued to play a prominent role in representing Spanish interests in her adoptive homeland. This was significant, as in 1511, Henry effectively turned his back on any offer of friendship from the French and allied with Ferdinand, as well as the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I, against France as part of the War of the League of Cambrai, a conflict which primarily played out in Italy. Having done so, Henry then assembled a large military force which was sent to the Basque Country in northeastern Spain with the goal of Henry and Ferdinand launching a joint military campaign to conquer Guyenne in southwestern France for England. Henry would, no doubt, have been disappointed by the outcome. His own troops mutinied, while Ferdinand used the rump of the forces to conquer the small Pyrenean Principality of Navarre for Spain. Despite this setback, clear signs of Catherine's prominent role in English affairs were seen the following year. In June of 1513, Henry launched his own campaign to France, which he led in person, across the English Channel to land in the north of the country. In the weeks that followed, he campaigned in northeastern France in association with the Austrians, Habsburgs. In his absence, Catherine served as governor of the realm and captain general of England. During the late summer and autumn of 1513, it was a critical period. On August 22nd, King James IV of Scotland, who was acting in defense of Scotland's traditional ally, the French, invaded northern England. A large English army was quickly gathered, much of the logistical work being carried out by Catherine and the government's senior ministers. As a result, when the Earl of Surrey, Thomas Howard, commanded an English army against the Scots at Flodden on September 9th, they won one of the greatest victories over the Scottish ever achieved by English arms. Catherine had been gathering together a reserve force to aid Surrey and was heading north with it when news of the victory at Flodden was received. She also learned that King James and several of his senior nobles had died on the field. Writing to Henry, she stated, "In this, your grace shall see how I can keep my promises, sending you for your banners a king's coat." Yet, as much as Catherine's prominent role in the politics of the early 1510s indicates the influence she held at this time, there were already signs of future trouble brewing. The Queen, quite infamously, had a difficult gynecological history. She was reported to be pregnant on numerous occasions during the first 10 years or so of her and Henry's marriage. Some of these instances are based on ambassadorial reports, which featured mere rumors at the royal court, but there are more concrete details of some of Catherine's natal history. She became pregnant with a daughter very soon after her and Henry's wedding. but she miscarried in January 1510. This was followed, within a few months, by a fresh pregnancy. This time, she gave birth to a baby boy on January 1st, 1511, who was named Henry after his father and grandfather and anointed as Prince of Wales. But he died 7 weeks later, on February 22nd. It's possible that there was another boy born in September 1513, just days after the Battle of Flodden. But if this is so, he died within hours, or days at the most. Another son was certainly stillborn in the early winter of 1514. It was not until a girl, Mary, was born in February 1516 that a child survived. But England had never had an undisputed queen, and as the years went by, Henry would pine ever more for a son to secure the succession and Tudor rule. The full implications of Catherine's natal woes would not become clear until the 1520s. In the meantime, the international situation was entering a more fluid state. England had made peace with France in 1514, as part of which it had been agreed that Henry's 18-year-old sister Mary would marry King Louis XII of France. Louis was 34 years older than Mary, but happily for the bride, he died just a few months later and was succeeded by his cousin, Francis, a member of a cadet branch of the Valois royal family. The following year, Catherine may have been influential, yet again, in getting Henry to agree to a renewal of the alliance with Spain. But when old King Ferdinand died himself in 1516, he was succeeded by his grandson, Charles, as successor to his mother's Spanish kingdom and his father Philip's Habsburg inheritance. Charles V would become the most powerful monarch in Europe, simultaneously ruling Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, and much of Italy, as well as serving as Holy Roman Emperor from 1519 onwards. The diplomatic map of Europe was now profoundly altered, and when Henry decided he wanted to end his marriage to Catherine several years later, he would be impeded by her nephew, the most powerful ruler Europe had seen for several centuries. This diplomatic realignment led to a curious experiment in diplomacy being undertaken towards the end of the 1510s by one of Henry's senior ministers and an individual who would play a large role in Catherine's affairs in later years. Thomas Wolsey had risen as the king's almoner in 1509 to become the Archbishop of York and then to be made a cardinal of the church in 1515. By that time, he was also Henry's leading minister and handled an immense amount of government business. In 1518, he determined to try to get the major Western and Central European powers to agree to renounce making war on each other for some time in order to present a united front against the expanding Islamic Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. Though England, France, the papacy, and Spain all agreed to the Treaty of London, it was soon discarded as Henry yet again looked to make war on France in the early 1520s. Nevertheless, it is an interesting episode in Wolsey's rise to the position of European statesman. He would soon be acting inadvertently as one of Catherine's supporters in her fight to resist Henry's desire for an annulment of their marriage. The causes of the king's later wish to end his marriage to Catherine were dynastic, as Catherine suffered stillbirth after miscarriage in the early 1510s. Henry had taken a mistress as early as 1514. There were several more in the years that followed, and in 1519, one of these, Elizabeth Blount, gave birth to a boy. The king acknowledged him, and he was named Henry after him, with the addition of the title Fitzroy, meaning the son of the king. However, while this new child was acknowledged by Henry, he was still illegitimate in law and could not succeed to the throne. What was increasingly at issue was Catherine's age. She had been over 5 years older than Henry when they married in 1509. In 1520, she was 35. This was certainly not so old that Catherine couldn't possibly become pregnant again, or even still have multiple children, but her complicated and arduous natal history, with its many miscarriages and stillbirths, did not inspire confidence in anyone at the English royal court that Catherine was likely to give birth to the legitimate male heir that Henry so desired. As the months and years ticked past in the early 1520s, this concern turned more and more to a certainty. As it did, Henry would seek to end the marriage. We should pause here to ask, Who exactly was the woman who had become so central to English political affairs in the 1520s? Because of later events, Catherine has sometimes been depicted as merely a shadowy presence in England, a distant figure who eventually led her husband to begin tearing England apart. But she is often a personality-less figure in all of this. In reality, Catherine was a tenacious individual, one who expressed her mind forcefully throughout her adult years in England, often to the annoyance of the sitting Spanish ambassador at the Tudor court, a pious Catholic like her parents. She was heavily influenced early on in her time in the country by her confessor, Diego Fernandez, and she was a major supporter of the observant Franciscan movement in her adopted homeland. Despite her forcefulness, she could quite effortlessly perform her role as queen, presiding over court gatherings next to Henry, and dispensing patronage where appropriate to the church and others attached to the court. Yet her direct influence on England's politics was minimal, and Catherine did not wish for any greater involvement. Moreover, she retained her Spanish identity throughout her years in England. And while she learned to speak English fluently, within her own private apartments and household there was a largely Spanish staff, and Catherine continued to confess in Spanish even several decades after leaving her homeland. Catherine was also a noted patron of scholars. She was already fluent in Spanish, French, and Latin when she arrived in England. And although her progress was slow at first, she eventually did become fluent in English. In her adult years, she excelled in her Latin learning beyond what would be expected of a European royal in the 16th century. She patronized both the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge as queen, visiting both and interceding directly with Henry over issues and benefactions relating to Queen's College and St. John's College in Cambridge. She also patronized several of the most prominent intellectuals of England in the 1510s and 1520s, notably the antiquarian and poet John Leland, the humanist and physician Thomas Linacre, and the religious reformer and diplomat Richard Pace. She is best remembered, however, for urging the leading Spanish humanist scholar Juan Luis Vives to come to England for a period in the mid-1520s. Here, Vives finished some work on the Church Father Augustine, but his English sojourn is most notable for having composed The Education of a Christian Woman, a highly progressive treatise that argued for the universal education of women. The work was written as a guide of sorts for the Princess Mary and was dedicated to Catherine. It points to the centrality of learning and education to the Queen's worldview. Shortly after Vives completed his educational treatise, the Princess Mary was sent to Ludlow Castle in 1525 to begin maintaining her own household there and to be educated by tutors such as Catherine's former chaplain and the noted Catholic scholar Richard Featherston. But even as this was occurring, Henry was proactively seeking ways to ensure that a male heir would arrive to supplant Mary as next in line to the throne. In 1521, Henry had yet again allied with his wife's nation when he and Charles V agreed to go to war again against France. 4 years of conflict followed before Henry effectively decided to go his own way and made an independent peace with King Francis. And in the months that followed, a remarkable shift in affairs occurred as Henry now began to nail his colors to the mast in favor of the French against the Habsburgs. Though most of the fighting in the War of the League of Cognac, which followed, occurred in Italy as part of the conflict between France and Spain for hegemony there, England played a slight role too. For her part, Catherine despaired in private in the mid-1520s that she was no longer consulted by her husband in these matters, and she rarely heard from her nephew Charles in the way she had during her father's lifetime when it came to Spanish affairs. If Catherine was increasingly sidelined by her husband in the determination of England's place on the SEA international stage, it simply reflected her position at court. Following the birth of Henry Fitzroy in 1519, the king had entered another affair, this one with Mary Boleyn, the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, who had caught Henry's eye on her wedding day, of all days, in 1520. Mary was a somewhat scandalous figure who had spent time at the French court in the late 1510s, while her father was serving as England's ambassador to France. She was ordered home too, England in 1519 for having engaged in several affairs with French courtiers, including King Francis himself. Now, following her liaisons with Henry, it was rumored that she had borne the king 2 sons in the early 1520s. But if she did, he did not acknowledge them. Perhaps because the exact parentage of the children could not be determined. Yet Mary was ultimately to become a peripheral figure. Rather, it was her sister who would take center stage in the 1520s. In 1526, Henry began a new affair with Anne Boleyn, Mary's younger sibling, and this time Henry was more committed to his new mistress. And by 1527, he was determined that he would obtain a divorce from Catherine in order to marry again and hopefully produce a legitimate male heir, what was to become known as the King's Great Matter. His goal of achieving a divorce from his wife of nearly 20 years would eventually turn every aspect of English, political, social, and religious life upside down. Henry first alerted his wife in the early summer of 1527 that he was looking into the possibility of a divorce because, after 18 years of marriage, his scruples had suddenly been challenged by the chance that their marriage had been unlawful. All along, the argument being pursued was that because Catherine had married Henry's brother, Arthur, and because that earlier marriage had been consummated, Henry had effectively married his own sister in 1509, and this was intolerable in religious law. Therefore, an annulment had to be granted for the marriage. This was hypocritical of Henry in the extreme to suddenly claim that his scruples around this issue had suddenly been felt 18 years after the event. However, Catherine's family background complicated the matter for Henry. She immediately wrote to her nephew, Charles V, to inform him of the situation. As luck would have it, Charles's forces in Italy had recently captured the city of Rome, and, with Pope Clement VII effectively Charles's prisoner there, Henry would not receive an annulment to his marriage any time soon. With the possibility of an annulment being quickly granted dashed, Cardinal Wolsey now became a central figure in events. And in July 1527, he was dispatched to France, where he envisaged the possibility of setting up a council of cardinals who would run the Roman Catholic Church while Clement was incapacitated in Rome. Such a council would be able to quickly grant Henry his divorce in tandem. And without Wolsey's knowledge, Henry also dispatched the diplomat William Knight to Rome to seek a dispensation from Clement to at least allow Henry to marry again if the divorce could not be granted straight away. Effectively, this was a request from the King of England, whose scruples were now severely affecting his judgment, that the Pope would sanction him to commit bigamy and have 2 queens at once. Thinking better of this particularly crazed request, Henry quickly sent a messenger after Knight, who caught up with him somewhere in France and rescinded the order. In any event, both Wolsey and Knight's missions would produce nothing, and in England, Henry was beginning to assemble a collection of church scholars and lawyers who could provide him with legal justifications for the annulment of his marriage. As he did, the great matter would come to dominate court life in England during the late 1520s. As the months went by, the situation altered somewhat. In Rome, Pope Clement was released from captivity by Charles V in December 1527, but the Spanish still controlled the city, and his freedom of action was still heavily curtailed. He eventually consented to send a papal legate in the shape of Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio to England in the autumn of 1528 to deliberate on the case with Cardinal Wolsey. Secretly, Campeggio had orders to delay the situation as much as possible and to look for an alternative solution to the problem. Having arrived there, he and Wolsey had an audience with Catherine on October 24, 1528, following which she requested Campeggio to hear her confession on the 27th. At this, she related to him that although they were married for several months, in late 1501 and early 1502, and that she and Arthur had shared a bed on several occasions during that time, the marriage had never been consummated as they had not had relations. On this issue hinged the entire legal argument which Henry's team of lawyers and churchmen had been devising. If Catherine had never had relations with Arthur, their argument had no substance to it, and no divorce would be forthcoming. Eventually, in late May 1529, the legatine court assembled. Catherine quickly appealed for the hearing to be adjourned, and for her case to be heard in Rome. On June 21st, both she and Henry spoke before the court, as did Wolsey. For such a significant moment in English political and religious history, there is a frustrating lack of detail in the available sources as to what each of them actually said that day. But we do know that Catherine, at one stage, knelt before Henry and protested that she had been his lawful wife for 20 years. Immediately after this, she left the court, despite the calls for her to remain. As a result, Campeggio had to send word to Rome that Catherine was now refusing to cooperate with the proceedings. By the time the message was sent to the Vatican, and a response was formulated, the summer recess was nearing in London. On July 23rd, Wolsey convinced Campeggio to close proceedings for a time. But it was clear when he did this that there was no intention of resuming activity in the autumn. Having exhausted the possibility of coming to an agreement with Rome and Pope Clement, Henry's ministers, officials, and advisors would increasingly look to find an alternative way of obtaining his divorce and bringing Anne to his great matter. Throughout this tense period, Catherine and Henry had understandably seen less and less of each other. It should be noted that Henry maintained a clear fondness for her, and even at the height of affairs in late 1528, he is recorded by the contemporary chronicler and historian, Edward Hall, as having stated, "If I were to marry again, if the marriage might be good, I would surely choose her above all other women." Yet while she had continued to preside over much of court life as queen, she and Henry rarely dined together by 1529, except on major court occasions where the absence of one would set tongues wagging at court. Henry was also often absent, increasingly in the company of Anne Boleyn and her growing court faction. Somewhat bizarrely, throughout this period, Henry continued to have Catherine sew his shirts for him, something which infuriated Anne. For her part, Catherine tried to act in as dignified a manner as possible at court, despite her precarious and embarrassing position. She wrote frequently to Charles V and Pope Clement and pressed her nephew's new ambassador, Eustace Chapuys, to implore Rome to categorically refuse to sanction any divorce. However, Clement did not oblige her in this and stated simply that he would not agree to resolve the case unless the parties appeared in Rome. As Clement delayed, Henry grew more desperate, and the Boleyn faction, which included Anne's powerful uncle Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, increasingly argued that Wolsey was the main impediment to progress. As the most powerful churchman in England, and one of the 2 legates appointed by Rome to decide the case, it was in his power to advance the divorce. Henry, who possessed the peculiar combination of being both a coward and a tyrant, did not wish to destroy his most trusted servant and advisor, but felt powerless to resist the growing calls for Wolsey to be supplanted. Eventually, he began revoking the cardinal's powers and stripping him of his properties and wealth. He was, however, permitted to remain as Archbishop of York, and so he set out for the north of England to his diocese in the autumn of 1530, during which journey he died. But while Wolsey was now gone, his removal did not provide a solution in and of itself to the king's great matter. That would only come through the intercession of one of Wolsey's protégés, a rising official called Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell would become one of the critical figures in the months that followed in the new line of argument to obtain the divorce. This held that the English Church was not under the jurisdiction of Rome and that the English crown held supreme authority over the English Church. As such, Henry could grant himself a divorce. Much of what followed in the course of the early 1530s was intimately connected to the religious turmoil shaking Europe. The Protestant Reformation had begun in Germany, led by the reformer Martin Luther, in 1517, and in the years that followed, it swept through Central, Western, and Northern Europe. As individuals questioned every type of received knowledge about the Church and how it was run, it was in this climate that the scholars and lawyers whom Henry had assembled to obtain his divorce began arguing that the kings of England held supremacy over the English Church. This was the line followed from 1531 onwards. Cromwell became central to pushing it through as he coerced England's leading churchmen to accept it. In the process, the establishment of Henry's supremacy would create opportunities for new church figures with Protestant sympathies to gain high office. And, in the act of acquiring his divorce, Henry's actions at this time, inadvertently also, initiated the English Reformation. But to Henry in 1531 and 1532, that would have seemed somewhat immaterial, or at least the lesser of two evils, the greater one being his inability to get a divorce. Thus, Henry threw his full support behind establishing the supremacy in the early 1530s in order to finally resolve his great matter. Catherine must have known that her time as Queen of England was limited, when in February 1531, a clerical convocation affirmed Henry's position as supreme head of the Church of England. In Rome, Pope Clement responded to this by offering to allow the case concerning his divorce to take place on neutral ground somewhere outside of England or Rome. But there would be no such case heard now. On May 31, 1531, a deputation of 30 of Henry's leading officials and counselors met with Catherine in order to work out a compromise. Given that the king was determined to proceed, she tenaciously resisted, defending both the supremacy of Rome over the English Church and the validity of her own marriage, yet again stating that she had never consummated her marriage with Arthur. 6 weeks later, on July 11, 1531, she met with Henry for the last time. Thereafter, she was ordered to head north to the Moor Palace in Hertfordshire, effectively being banished from the sight of the royal court. She was also to be cruelly separated from her daughter. Mary was still the royal heir and would reside at Windsor Castle, though she couldn't have known it at the time that she left London in the summer of 1531. Catherine would never see her daughter again. The bitter separation was entering its last stages. At the Moor Palace, Catherine was allowed to maintain a considerable household, but she was prohibited from returning to London. In the late autumn, a further deputation of Henry's officials came to visit her. The hope was that Catherine would give up her objection to a trial being held in England to deliberate on the validity of her marriage. If she appeared at such a trial, there was no doubt that it would be stage-managed in such a way as to back up Henry's argument since 1527, that the marriage was invalid and an annulment would follow in due course. Catherine refused, but by now, the matter was out of her hands, and by the late summer of 1532, Anne Boleyn was presiding over the royal court as though she were effectively queen, and in the autumn of that year she accompanied Henry on a royal visit to France. In November, she and Henry were married in secret. A more formal wedding took place in January 1533. By that time, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a supporter of the supremacy, had been installed as Archbishop of Canterbury. And finally, in May 1533, he convened a special clerical court at Dunstable Priory, which declared Henry and Catherine's marriage to be invalid and annulled. 5 days later, he retroactively sanctioned Henry and Anne's marriage. At last, after 6 years, Henry had obtained his divorce from Catherine. What would Catherine do now? For the second time in her long English odyssey, she found herself cast adrift in a country where her purpose was now unclear. On the first occasion, she had been a young woman with the vague prospect of a new marriage to Henry, being worked out in the aftermath of Arthur's death. But this time, there was no such prospect. Yet a return to her native Spain was out of the question. She had not been there in over 30 years, and she had few ties to her homeland anymore. Her sister Juana was still there, though still living, effectively under house arrest since her father had accused her of madness decades earlier. Her son, who had effectively usurped her position as ruler of Castile, had left her under house arrest at Tordesillas. The two sisters had not exactly fared well in a world run by men. For Catherine, if Spain held no attraction for her, England offered the only reason for her to reside anywhere. Her daughter Mary was there, and Catherine would have to fight too. Maintain Mary's position in the new dispensation, which had effectively sidelined her, with the annulment of Catherine's marriage to Henry. As such, the conclusion of Henry's great matter early in 1533 did not bring Catherine's own personal struggle with her husband to an end. At first, Henry attempted to placate Catherine with an offer of the title of Princess Dowager. Catherine refused, and she was consulting with the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapais around this time to try to have him press the papacy to issue a definitive condemnation of Henry's renunciation of his marriage to her. Simultaneously, it is clear that there was widespread public support throughout England for Catherine and her cause. This was exhibited most publicly in the prophecies of Elizabeth Barton. Barton, who is variously remembered as the Holy Maid of Kent and the Mad Maid of Kent, had gained a reputation throughout England in the 1520s as a prophetess who had visions. She had even met with Cardinal Wolsey and Henry in 1528, but despite their earlier acquaintance, Barton was preaching in 1532 that if Henry remarried, he would die soon afterwards. She even claimed that she had seen the place in hell where he would be sent. Her public appearances gained large crowds that expressed support for Catherine and vilified Anne. Thus, although Barton herself was eventually arrested, tried, and hanged at Tyburn on charges of treason, the episode points towards how much support Catherine enjoyed from the common people of the country over which she had been queen for more than 23 years. Conversely, Anne had been received in a tepid fashion by the London crowds during her coronation. As 1533 turned into 1534, Catherine's position became more and more awkward for Henry. In March of that year, the papacy finally issued its pronouncements on the divorce. Unsurprisingly, they were entirely supportive of Catherine's position. Then, in May, Catherine refused to swear an oath which the government was asking people to subscribe to, which would recognize any children that Anne Boleyn would have by the king. This would place Anne's children ahead of Mary in the royal succession, and Catherine was unwilling to accept it. She wrote to Mary, advising her to refuse the oath as well. At the same time, she was forced to move to Kimbleton House in Huntingdonshire, and her household was much reduced to match her more limited financial means. Those who remained primarily consisted of about 24 Spaniards, the core group, being her confessor, her maids, several stewards, and some grooms. Here she insisted on continuing to be addressed as the Queen, whatever her aspirations were, though her life was increasingly restricted. She had to get permission to receive visitors. And even when Mary was ill in late 1534 and early 1535, Henry refused Catherine permission to visit her. The concern was that if Catherine and her daughter managed to escape together to the continent, they could later press Mary's claim to the throne with the backing of Charles V and the papacy. In the intricate European politics of the 16th century, this was not an entirely unfounded fear. Catherine remained defiant to the last. Throughout 1535, she continued to pursue various channels to request that the new Pope, Paul III, should issue a declaration stating that Henry was excommunicated from the Church as a result of his disobeying the papacy's directives regarding their marriage. However, these efforts were sabotaged by her own nephew. Charles V was preparing to go to war again with France, and the last thing he needed was an announcement from the papacy which would push England into supporting the French in the new conflict that eventually broke out in 1536. Thus, Catherine would never live to see her husband condemned fully by Rome. Her health had been deteriorating in the autumn of 1535, and by December, when Ambassador Chapais visited her, she was very ill. She worsened further in the first days of January and died at Kimbleton at 2 p.m. On January 7th, an autopsy of sorts afterwards revealed that her heart was damaged and black throughout. It is likely that this was a secondary condition caused by a melanotic carcinoma. Rumors that she had been poisoned are very unlikely to have been accurate. She was buried at Peterborough Abbey, although no monument was erected to mark the site as being the grave of the woman who had been Queen of England for nearly a quarter of a century. The England that Catherine parted from in 1536 was just beginning to enter a vast period of change which was closely tied to Henry's quest to divorce her. The drive to establish Henry as supreme head of the English Church had seen religious figures such as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, obtain control over much of the Church throughout England. In the years that followed, these Individuals began reforming church practice and introduced a version of the new Protestant religion. Just as Catherine left the world, the hundreds of monasteries and nunneries which had dotted England for centuries were being shut down, while in churches all over the country, altars were being stripped back to more austere interiors in line with Protestant practice. Though there would be Catholic reactions and periods of more radical Protestantism in the 20 years that followed, nothing in the end could turn back the tide of religious and social change which was initiated through efforts to find a resolution to Henry VIII's great matter. Perhaps Henry would not have minded. In October 1537, he got his wish when a legitimate male heir called Edward was born to his third wife, Jane Seymour. Yet that son, for which Henry had strived for so long, would only rule for 6 years after Henry himself died in 1547. Thus, Catherine's daughter, Mary, became Queen of England. After all, in 1553, Catherine of Aragon is one of the most curious figures in English political history. In a great many accounts of the tumultuous events of the late 1520s and early 1530s, she is regularly mentioned but comes across as a personality-less key character. She is usually presented as the roadblock which prevented Henry VIII from marrying Anne Boleyn, but Henry and Anne are the personalities in these accounts. And Catherine is an important but shadowy figure in the background, of which nothing is ever usually said, except that she had to be removed. This does her a disservice. Catherine was a proud, tenacious woman who overcame a considerable degree of adversity. After being cast adrift in a foreign land as a teenager during a time when women of her background were often mere bartering tools in international diplomacy, as queen, she acted as a progressive patron of scholars and supported the education of women in England. And then, when her troubled natal history eventually led Henry to try to dispense with her, she doggedly fought to maintain her own position, and, more importantly, her daughter's position as heir to the throne of England. All of this stands considerably in her favor. Curiously enough, perhaps the greatest testament to Catherine's character was provided by Henry VIII himself. Of Henry's other 5 wives, there were 2 he did not dispense of. His third wife, Jane Seymour, died owing to postnatal complications after giving birth to the future King Edward VI, while his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, outlived Henry by a year. However, the other 3 were not treated kindly. His marriage to his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, was quickly annulled in 1540 after Henry stated, "She is nothing so fair as hath been reported." His 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was beheaded after she was found guilty of having committed adultery, while Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry spent so many years trying to divorce Catherine in order to marry her, was found guilty of treason on quite possibly spurious charges in 1536 and beheaded as well. Just 3 years after marrying Henry. By way of contrast, Henry, who probably respected Catherine more than any of his other wives, allowed his former Spanish consort to live on in England after he had finally obtained his divorce. Though her liberties were restricted at a time when there was a very real fear that Charles V would declare war on England over the divorce, at least Catherine kept her head, which is more than many others who got in Henry's way could say. And so we conclude part 2 of our gentle journey through the lives of England's most remarkable queens. We have witnessed the unwavering devotion of Lady Margaret Beaufort, whose love for her son Henry would ultimately place the Tudor dynasty on the throne of England. And we have followed the steadfast courage of Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess whose refusal to yield would shake the very foundations of English religion and society. These women, each in their own way, demonstrated that true power often lies not in the crown itself, but in the quiet determination to protect what matters most, whether that be a beloved child's future or one's own deeply held convictions. Join us next time for part 3, our final episode, where we'll explore the dramatic lives of Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour, 2 women whose brief but intense relationships with Henry VIII would forever change the course of English history. Until then, sweet dreams, dear listener, and may these tales of Tudor strength and Spanish resolve carry you. gently into peaceful slumber.